Okay, so I'm pleased to welcome today Dr. Mark Carnall from the Oxford Museum of Natural History, Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and he's going to talk to us about mollusk collections and how we can engage the public with them and the fantastic work that he's been doing. So, Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, and thanks for the invite. It's nice to kind of barge in, I guess, on the entoLIVE program and talk about some other inverts and molluscs are kind of near and dear to the work I do at the museum. Before we go on, I'll talk about these a little bit later, but I just want you to appreciate the title slide. So this is a work of art that one of the members of our early intervention art group, which we have at the university, created, inspired quite obviously by some of our cephalopod specimens, and I'll be talking a bit more about those later. So for those of you who don't know, by way of introduction, so I'm one of the collections managers at Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and if you've not visited it, here's what it looks like. Well, here's what the roof of it looks like. I've given you a sneak peek of some of the specimens on the ground floor, but I didn't want to give too much away. And one of my roles there, is I'm one of the collections managers. It's my responsibility to look after the non-entomological invertebrates as well as human remains, and so that involves managing the collection, identification of specimens, arranging access for researchers, answering inquiries, working on things like talks and public displays in this kind of fantastic building. And it's from this perspective, this very kind of privileged perspective, that I'm talking to you about some of the things that we do with the collections in this fantastic space. If you don't know it, then please do come by and visit. And one of the best kept secrets about, I think, all natural history museums in this country is we are here for you. So we kind of exist and are funded via various ways to not only make our specimens accessible, but also the information we hold about. So it's not that you have to be a world-leading researcher. If you have an interest in natural history and it's something we have in the collections, then we exist for you, not just the kind of public displays. A brief history, I will keep it brief. So the collections at Oxford, we claim, which we could debate with various caveats, that we're some of the oldest museums in the UK, possibly the world. There are many, many caveats on that, but our collections we can trace back to the 1680s, when a chap called Elias Ashmole, so those of you who have heard of the Ashmolean Museum, one of our sister museums at Oxford University, he gave a big collection of his material and material from other people to found these museums at Oxford University. And we have been there since. This is the old building we're in. So if you visit Oxford, or if you know Oxford well, you'll recognize these kind of really ugly boggle-eyed busts on the outside. This is the old home of the museum, and before it kind of burst out through oversize. It's currently the Museum of History of Science. In 1860, after lots of people who would recognize as scientists today across Oxford really petitioned for a place specifically for science. So after lots and lots of petitioning and fundraising, this building was built, and initially it housed all of science. So you'll see this on the history of the room, or the rooms when you visit the museum. So not only do we have reflection of nature in the ironwork and the sculpture, which has plants and animals pouring out from, but as you go around, you'll see these references to mathematics, astronomy, medicine. So this is back when, for example, medicine would be 2 blokes and an assistant. It's now however many hospitals and however many thousands of staff and students. The same for chemistry, geology. So the museum remains at the heart of the science area, but those departments have fledged out, and we have the collections departments that remain. As a museum, there's kind of 3 major strands to what we do. So one of which is public engagement in all the ways you can imagine, be it talks, things like festivals, performance, film nights, all different ways that people can get involved with the museum and the work of the museum. Of course, we have the collections. We say we have about 7 million specimens in the collection, which makes us one of the kind of biggest smaller museums, if you like. So you've got some of the nationals, which are larger in the UK, and then our collection size. And that collection goes back to 1680 all the way through to today, and all the kinds of natural history you can imagine: eggs, taxidermy, nests, shells, pinned insects, as well as the associated library and archive. And we also have a research wing as well, so colleagues at the museum who are actively working on biological research, either in the collections or out in the field. And those are the three kind of strands of the museum, which you can expect to see when you visit the museum. And because of the age of our collections and our locations, we have some really, really rich collections, not just in terms of volume, but some of the material we have preserved. So here's a few of the kind of highlights. Of course, you know, all the specimens I look after have equal priority to me. On the top left there, we have the so-called Oxford dodo, so the only known dodo soft tissue in the world. The top right there, just finished celebrating a birthday, is one of the first dinosaur specimens, Megalosaurus, named in 1824. So we have some of the first described dinosaur material here from Oxfordshire. We have rocks, minerals, and precious gems in our kind of petrology and geological collections. And we also have, we sometimes refer to them as our living collections. So if you've been to the museum, you will have seen our big tower. And we have one of the longest kind of monitored populations of swifts that we kind of welcome back every year. So that's an overview of where I work and where I'm coming from. I'm here today to talk to you about molluscs. I'm always really excited to talk about molluscs because for many reasons, I think they're kind of an underdog group of organisms. And I'll talk around that a bit later. But here are just some of the many ways that people and molluscs have interacted. Some of these you may recognize, some not. So we have, for example, you know, molluscs appearing on stamps. This squid here is from an Egyptian temple in Thebes. They're kind of carved into the rock, into the wall underneath the boat. This scallop here, interestingly, for whatever reason, we have a Keen's mustard advertisement behind the scenes at the museum. And I've walked past it perhaps every single day that I've worked there. And I've always wondered about this trademark. So knowing this talk was coming up, I traced where, you know, the company, the subsidiary, the company that now owns Keen Mustard. So if you're from Australia, New Zealand, you might recognize the brand. And I kind of asked you, why is it that a scallop was associated with your brand? It was on all the tins. And in this version here, it's where the trademark sits. In other versions, it has the established either side. So they did get back to me, which is great. Thank you, the McCormick Corporation. But unfortunately, their records don't record why this mollusk was so prominently featured on their mustard brand. Molluscs not obviously associated with mustard, certainly not in my mind. Continuing up here, we have these kind of, you know, Minoan vases with this beautiful kind of Argonaut artwork on it. So not only can we accurately identify what this is, this depiction remains more accurate than a lot of thinking about Argonauts, you know, in the thousands of years afterwards. Top right here we have Ghanaian currency, so in Akan, CD, so the name of the currency in Ghana at the moment, CD, means cowrie shell. And it kind of harkens back to when there were shell economies, and the National Bank used to have these CDs on the outside, these big metal CDs on the outside. Unfortunately, moved. One of the most recognizable, or one of the molluscs you probably pass more than most, and perhaps I've never thought about it, is the shell from the Shell Company. So this is a more familiar version here, the yellow version there. The version on the left is supposedly one of the original kind of brands for that company when it started out as a shell trading company. So the name Shell directly comes from that. This one in the middle, now sort of a blast from the past, now that we just tap our debit or credit cards to pay for everything. But the Oyster card, you know, why not even think about the relationship between an Oyster card and the animals itself? And when they were putting together, the company was putting together, you know, the branding, this tap as you go product, they settled on Oyster, partly as a reflection of kind of London's the Thames estuary oyster industry, but also the kind of idea of, you know, the world is your oyster, which, you know, Shakespeare heads will know it's kind of a misappropriated or a misremembered quote. The actual quote is the world's mine oyster. And also, you know, the idea of something being secure and there being a precious pearl there. Again, all related to molluscs. Here, didn't really plan this when I put this image together, but this is a very timely image. There are many images and depictions of kind of octopuses representing political powers or political individuals, and the kind of ideal that they sprawl and have their kind of arms and everything You also find molluscs in kind of popular culture. Here we have a Pokemon kind of standing in for all of those. And this mollusk shell on the back. This is a Slowbro, which evolves from a Slowpoke when this kind of shell bites the tail. So in this Pokemon, we kind of have ideas about things like hermit crabs reusing these shells. But in Japanese folklore, these particular kind of shells have a lot of folklore associated with them. There's a particular kind of ogre called a Sazai. I think it's Sazai. Yeah, Sazai Oni. So a spirit creature or an ogre that can change shape between a shell and a person. And the particular mythology associated with these shells, which doesn't really come out in the Pokemon games, is that they steal sailors' testicles. I'll let you look that up on your own time. Of course, we have molluscs. Their wonderful shape and architecture inspires real-world architecture. This is the Guggenheim Museum, which is supposedly, interesting, they kind of say on their own website, supposedly our building was inspired by perhaps a nautilus shell. And if you keep your eyes up, lots of these buildings will take inspiration from those. Down here we have, the wonderful snails on the margins of illuminated manuscripts. Sometimes they're attacking people, sometimes people are sitting on them. So we've had this really long association with them. This rather unassuming image down here is one that I've been quite interested in. So you might be aware that when the Voyager probes were sent off, some of the most distant human objects, they had these golden discs on them. And lots of information was encoded on those golden discs should a alien intelligence kind of get hold of them. So there's recordings of a welcome in many different languages. There are some songs. There are some other audio recordings, but there are 112 images kind of encoded on that. And Carl Sagan and his colleagues kind of pulled together these 100-odd images. And I think it's really interesting and poignant that one of the images they decided to send out was this section turbinellid shell. So shell which has been removed, so you can see the kind of columella and how this thing grows. Again, as a side project, I tried to find the origin of this image. So it's, interestingly, if you're an alien intelligence however many millions of miles away from Earth, and you get hold of this golden disc, you can use those images for whatever you want. And this is one of the images that is kind of under copyright. And so I contacted the copyright holders to try and work out where it came from and who made it. Unfortunately, it didn't get back. So just really interesting that A, there's a rights management issue, but B, this image representing, a really important part of Terran life and culture remains a bit enigmatic to me, certainly. And the bottom there, we find molluscs represented all kinds of animated shows and films, etc. So although molluscs might not be familiar to some of you, I know that some of you are molluscan scientists, so you'll know. Just from these few examples, you can see that it is something, they are a group of animals which have these long associations with, there's lots of symbolism and iconography associated with them. And I would ask you all to just keep your eyes out for molluscs. Here in Oxford, we're almost as far as you can get from the sea anywhere in the UK, but there are a number of molluscs which I kind of pass on my daily commute, be it a graffiti octopus, a church with a scallop on it representing pilgrimage, etc. And send them to me as well. I'm always interested to come across these examples of molluscs in popular culture. So hopefully, we recognize some of these, but I wanted to take us a little bit of a step back, just so that we're all on the same page, because perhaps some of you aren't aware of what molluscs are. So these, a while ago, the BBC did a really nice article. They wanted to try and get a photograph of every major group of animal. So hopefully, as you're aware, there are non-living things such as a pot noodle, a brick, etc. And then we divide living organisms into these major groups. So we have fungi and bacteria and plants. All of these we unite as the animals, and sometimes it changes, but there are 30-odd different major groups of animals. If we kind of sat down for 5 minutes and wrote down all the animals we could think of, we'd probably end up with a lot of animals in this group here. These are the chordates, including the vertebrates. So this is where you find your mammals, your amphibians, your fish, your reptiles and birds. It's also where you find humans. We might get to some of the guys in this big group here, arthropods. So that includes your insects, your spiders, your scorpions, your crabs, your lobsters, etc. And one of those major groups, in fact, the second largest in terms of number of species is here, representing our group we're going to talk about today, the mollusca. So why I kind of like to talk about them is because I think, considering they're the second largest group, and one of the groups of animals which we're quite familiar with, some of these you will only come across in the deep sea or under the microscope or very hard to reach parts of the world. But mollusk is probably one of the animals that you could go and have a rummage in a green space or your garden, and we'd probably find. Yet in my long years of working in museums and engaging with the public, people are far less kind of familiar or okay or comfortable with what a mollusk is, unlike, say, in the vertebrate groups or indeed the arthropods. Don't feel bad if you too are really unsure about what a mollusk is or isn't. We'll go over that in a bit. It's something that has troubled anyone and everyone who's thought about mollusks. And so we'll cover that next briefly. And an introduction to kind of the history of mollusks. So as far as we can understand it, the human study of these animals, we've seen, there are some of these very, very old carvings. We know that there are shell cultures who are using shell for jewelry or food that go way, way back. But in terms of written record and people's deep thinking about this group of animals is very limited, like many other kinds of organisms. So we start with Aristotle, and we start with Aristotle with many different animal groups. He wrote this series Historia Animalium, 9 of 10 volumes of which still exist. And it's from him that we get the word mollusca. So he, in looking at the relationships between different organisms, he referred to a group called Malacia, which means soft-bodied. So interestingly, because today we think of mollusks as being things with a hard shell, and the OG mollusks, if you like, were the soft-bodied ones. And he had this way of thinking about them. So was somewhat obsessed about sanguinity, not quite in the same way that we think about with blood or not. So he characterized these soft-bodied organisms as without blood, possessing arms and proboscises. He describes them as sensitive and vegetative. So apart from rocks, which are neither sensitive or vegetative, plants are vegetative. All the animals are sensitive and vegetative souls. And then it's only humans which have a rational, sensitive, vegetative soul. And their qualities are cold and wet. Some of the other organisms we now understand to be mollusks. We're in another group of hard-shelled animals. He referred to the cockle and the trumpet shell, for example, also lacking blood, lacked legs, sensitive and vegetative souls, and had cold and dry qualities referring to the shell. Now, amazingly, of course, there were predecessors to Aristotle who perhaps thought about animals and how they're related, and definitely mollusks. Through preservation and translation biases, we don't have much of any of that recorded, and we really jump forward, 2,000 years to Linnaeus, who many of you may remember from school days, learning about classification. So Linnaeus came up with the classification system. That's where we get the binomial naming system. So for example, we're Homo sapiens, the idea that everything sits in this hierarchy. He was still drawing a lot on some of the wisdom of Aristotle or Aristotelian ideas. And in his editions of Systema Naturae, so these were these big works to try and classify all living organisms as we knew them. We find animals which we know to be mollusks today split all over the shop. So there are some tiny marine mollusks, which he included with his insect group. There are some soft-bodied mollusks, such as cuttlefish and octopus, which he grouped with the nematodes, earthworms, nematomorphs, as well as some of the chordates, so some of the group we belong to. And another group, the testacea, which refers to a hard shell. And so there were the hard shelly mollusks, as well as forams, the echinoderms, interestingly, as well as these medusa related to anemones and anemones themselves. So even, the kind of great biological thinkers, they also struggled with what mollusks were and weren't. And I think this is why, certainly in my experience, people are generally kind of unfamiliar with what mollusks are, what the word means, and what might be a mollusk. Skipping forward to today, here's kind of the current consensus on what mollusks are. So estimates, and you'll see this is quite a huge range, estimates for living species goes from 60,000 to 200,000 living species, very much depending on how you count them, whether you count things like subspecies, whether we count undescribed diversity, etc. And we have 8 major groups. Top 4 here are the most familiar ones. So we have the gastropods, which is your slugs and snails and relatives, both marine and terrestrial. They're represented by our geoduck is the bivalves, so think things like mussels, clams, scallops. Then, of course, we have the cephalopods, so that's your octopus and squid. The 4th group, we're starting to get a little bit obscure when it comes to general familiarity, although if you're a keen rock crawler, you will have seen these. These are the chitons. So these molluscs with these 8 kind of tessellating plates, they look a little bit like an air vent. Then we get to the kind of 4 more obscure ones. Very, very obscure groups, only 4 living species of these, the monoplacophorans. These were assumed to be a kind of gastropod or a snail until living ones were dredged up in the 1950s. They were known from the fossil record and had been collected previously, but it's only in the 1950s is recognized. These are another completely different way of being a mollusk, and we'll go into how in a second. These wonderful things called scaphopods or tusk shells. Again, if you're a keen beachcomber, you will very, very infrequently come across these. They're called tusk shells. We call them tusk shells because they look like mini tusks. So you kind of put one in each corner of your mouth. Once it's clean, you look like a little elephant. And then 2 very obscure ones. These are the latest addition, if you like, to the phylum Mollusca or the group Mollusca in the 1980s. These were previously grouped with sea cucumbers and related to things like sea urchins. These are soft-bodied. They almost completely lack a shell and are covered in these little hair-like spicules. So you can see if you're somebody like Aristotle or Linnaeus and you're looking at these kind of groups of organisms, you are very hard-pressed to find any kind of characteristic which unites them all. And this is precisely kind of the difficulty and what we see. So unlike insects or arthropods, I should say, if they have a hard shell with a segmented exoskeleton, so you can see that in a crab, a beetle, a butterfly. Unlike us, whereas if you have an internal skeleton, you'll find, with limbs, you'll find that in the amphibians and the mammals and bats and whatever. Very few of these robust characters you find in each one of these groups. So these are some of their suggested kind of universal characters of Mollusca. We've got, don't worry too much about what these are, but you'll see from these ticks and crosses, these percentages, there's not one feature that you find in every single group. So cephalopods, for example, not all of them possess a radula. They don't have a broad muscular foot. If you think about the big foot of a snail, they've modified those into arms. Bivalves, for example, completely lack a radula. And it's because of this kind of plasticity in their evolution, something about the pathways to modern molluscs, which means that they're very, very diverse. And this, I've picked some kind of extreme examples of that diversity here from some of these wonderful molluscs. So we have up here is Philirose. So this is a gastropod, so again related to the slug in the same group as in the slug and snail group. These are very, very small. This picture is very, very misleading. And in essence, hopefully you're looking at that and thinking that looks like a fish. You can even see a fin here, rear fins here, this kind of perhaps hammerhead-like projection here. So, completely unrecognizable to perhaps your common old garden snail, but still within that group. These are one of my favorite. Again, these are very, very small. One of my favorite gastropods, bright green snails in the family Julidae. These are marine, and unlike all other snails, which have a single shell or have lost their shell or reduced it, as with the slugs, these have 2 shells like a clam. Yeah, very, very misleading. This image here on the right it's very hard to see because it's from an ROV. This is a squid here, and it has this beautiful kind of fluorescent long tail, which goes on for many, many meters behind it. Quite what it does with it, we're not entirely sure, and how it grows, and it's something we only really find in that particular group. Lampsilus here, we have these freshwater bivalves, and what looks like a fish resting on it is not a fish resting on it. This is a kind of form of mimicry, so they have part of their soft tissue which looks like a fish, and the idea is that other fish will come up and either try to eat it or mate with it, and at that point these bivalves release their larvae into the fish, and so for a lot of freshwater bivalves, their larval development has to develop on the inside of fish gills, and this is their way of doing that. And then this bottom one here, just to show you that there are some molluscs which are parasitic. And so here we can just recognize the spires of these two snails, parasitic in this sea pig here. So again, you can be forgiven for looking at each of these organisms and the ones we've just covered and kind of saying, okay, yeah, those are all related to each other. And this is perhaps why people are less familiar with molluscs generally. In terms of their evolution relationships, I won't spend too much time on this, and we're still not entirely sure how these 8 major groups are related to each other. So if you think about our group, evolving from fish into amphibians and reptiles and mammals, and that's where you find us, almost all of these, of the 8 groups, have been put as ancestral to the other one or closely related to another one. And this diagram here just goes to show that all the published trees we have using molecular or morphological data don't really coincide anywhere in particular. So we're still kind of resolving the evolutionary order of these, because it's unlikely that there was, an ancestral mollusk from which all of these evolved from. So I'll just be talking through a handful of examples today of how we use the mollusk collections at Oxford University Museum of Natural History to try and engage members of the public. The reason why I wanted to do this is, one, because we have huge shell collections. There's a, shell collecting was a pastime and a hobby. Also, there are links there to kind of expansion of the empire, description of new species. So we have lots and lots and lots of shells as well as fluid preserved specimens. And so I just kept my eyes and ears open for, okay, when I next get an opportunity to do a public event, how can I use our mollusk collection to try and engage people with them? One of the first opportunities for this was we had an exhibition called Meet the Future, which was looking about the sustainability of the meat production and kind of how different countries, how much meat they eat, for example. So this was a perfect opportunity, particularly because we're based in the UK, to explore the issue of edible molluscs. Now, if you're from the coast in the UK, you'll be familiar with things like cockles and whelks and oysters. But for the most part, it doesn't make up a huge part of our national diet. So I ran around some of the kind of food shops of Oxfordshire, picking up, as you'll see here, Mediterranean and Asian mollusk products. There's also a bonus, a bar of soap in there, because if my colleague gave me this, if you have a bar of snail soap, then why wouldn't you use it? And so using these objects as a lure for people who are attending an event based on Meet the Future, I had kind of 2 mixed reactions, one of which would be people from Mediterranean or Asian cultures or families who would say, I recognize those are yummy. And then there were people perhaps from the UK who would look at them and go, ugh. After a while, my stool did start to kind of smell a bit with some of these defrosting cephalopods. So that was how to kind of get people involved by these recognizable kind of packaged foods, a discussion about what we do and what we don't eat. And then this led on to thinking about kind of the future of food. So very, very occasionally, species or groups of animals which aren't kind of typically fished are often in, perhaps we could switch our diets or our habits to these. We have a really good local example of this. So occasionally, and we don't really understand why, with these big booms of cuttlefish in our waters, called kind of the black gold rush, after the ink that they produce. We don't really know what causes them. They happen every now and then. The last time it happened was in 2017, and kind of the fishing fleet, augmented all of its fishing gear to go and catch them. 90%, over 90% of which was exported. So we're not huge cephalopod eaters in this country. We've got exported to America and Asia, and before really, conservation bodies could get their shoes on, the stocks were kind of overfished. This was then assessed in 2018. So with the starting point of, things that molluscs that you can and can't eat, we start to talk about things like sustainability and the idea that for some of these supposed future foods, is it more about switching to unregulated stocks rather than those that we're familiar with? And then following on from that, thinking about things like consciousness and animal rights. So there's this wonderful thing called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, which is where a bunch of philosophers and neuroscientists and biologists and etc. got together and kind of made this declaration about consciousness, and they extended it to cephalopod molluscs as well as various other animals. So I made little pocket versions of the Declaration of Consciousness, which people could take away and read, and we discussed, the intelligence or the supposed intelligence of molluscs, in particular octopuses, and kind of how that might relate to whether you eat them or not. Interestingly, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I can't cover it all here, but this book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? I highly recommend, because we're really limited in the ways in which we try and understand intelligence, and to be aware that we kind of compare things to toddler ages, or we get animals to do ridiculous things like press buttons and navigate mazes, whereas perhaps that's not something that they would naturally need to do. And behind that there is a really nice paragraph I like. So we might think of octopuses as being quite intelligent for various reasons. One of which is the quite human-like activity of unscrewing a jar. So you would have seen videos of octopuses unscrewing jars. Here's Helen and Messenger on that topic, kind of saying that actually octopuses are quite bad at unscrewing jars. So yes, you can teach them to do it, but they don't really, they don't get quicker at it, or they don't particularly remember it. Again, this is just a limitation in the way we think. So again, starting with those mollusk food products, having all these interesting discussions about the nature of consciousness and sustainability, which is very good. This is very topical. So there's now a New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness that came out very, very recently, much, much shorter than the Cambridge one. Again, looking at the idea of consciousness beyond us and in other animals. So that's there for you if you're particularly interested. Sometimes molluscs are kind of just very cool and interesting. So this is a wonderful group of molluscs called the xenophorids. So that means kind of xeno is alien or foreign, and phorid is to carry. And these are marine snails, which over the period of their life attach things to them. So this one here is attached to these very small fragments of shells. This one here is kind of, almost looks like in a pattern, attached these big bivalve shells to it. This one here has gone for a more chunkier kind of armored defense. So these are beautiful objects, and they're quite well represented in museum collections just because they're so interesting. There are a couple of species of other organism which are only known from being attached to these xenophorid gastropods. It takes them a couple of hours to kind of hold something in place, and they secrete this cement to attach it. So very kind of cool objects, and they can tell us information about their ecology because they literally attach it to them. However, and often with engaging the public, I like to kind of present people with real world problems. So not something that we've generated for the sake of an interactive, but we genuinely there's no real consensus over why they do this or what the advantage is. So using some of these specimens and having differences between how they were decorated, so really lightly decorated, really armored, really heavy, some which look like there's some kind of order or sense to the shells. Working with people, inevitably they came to a lot of these kind of ideas themselves, talking about why they might do this. So sometimes, I know that there are quite a few museum people and educators out there. Sometimes you run with the gifts that you get. Xenophorids are a very, very cool group, but I wanted to use the interaction with the interesting objects to kind of have a go at thinking about a hypothetical. So stimulating some creative thinking, but also trying to get in the perspective, I guess, of the xenophorid. Ending with, and often I think this is more interesting than what we do know sometimes, what we don't know. So even though these animals are very well described and long studied, there's no real consensus over why they do this activity. And if we look at the lightly covered ones and the ones which are attaching pebbles, they're probably not doing the same kind of thing. At the museum, we have unique opportunity in that we have our public displays. So we very rarely change over what we call our permanent displays. We do have these smaller interventive spaces. And I really wanted to challenge myself with one of these by focusing on limpets. So you might think of limpets as being particularly uninteresting molluscs. And if you think about all the philosophical associations with them, if you're a limpet, you're clinging to a rock and you're very hard to move or change your behavior. When you see them at low tide, they kind of look like this, and it's kind of the worst time to see them, I guess. They're not particularly charismatic in this form, but they're kind of cuties when you see them on the inside of an aquarium tank, for example. And I wanted to make these interesting by picking up on the idea that there's no such thing as a limpet. So although we see these are actually gastropods, but unlike the spiral shell, like the garden snail or a Venus comb, and they have the process of evolution uncoiled their shells. They just make a cap-like shell, as you can see here, with a big muscly foot, and essentially carry it around as a protective covering. This kind of way of uncoiling your shell and having a cap-like shell has evolved over 50 times independently within the gastropods. It's not like there's a ancestral limpet and then all its descendants are limpet. We see limpet-like shells across the gastropods over and over again. So it's kind of a reinventing independently the different kind of solution. So I had a rummage through the museum collections and picked all these things out and tried to get people there's no such thing as a limpet, which hopefully gets them thinking about what that means, and showing them the different kinds of being a limpet and not being related. Some of these are the only limpet-like shell in that entire group. Others, there's kind of a whole big group of them. And there's one particular species, I'll put some links here to the text of the display, which is delimpetizing. So limpetizing is, losing the coiled shell, becoming the cap. And this one particular species is thought to be recoiling, which is very interesting and something I was keen to kind of pick out. So even with limpets, I think with a bit of creative thinking and a fun hook, you can make them interesting. And every museum will have drawers and drawers and drawers of limpets. One of the other kind of organisms which talk about a lot, again, just using these beautiful objects, is the Argonaut. So you may have seen these, come across them in artwork, or if you read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you will come across them. And they make these beautiful objects which look very shelly, so they look very similar to a nautilus shell, which you have seen, and sometimes they're called a paper nautilus. However, they are an egg case, so they're kind of something which is manufactured by a kind of octopus, what we call an Argonaut. So even though these objects are relatively simple and beautiful and well represented in museums, I've been using these in kind of teaching and training. So there's beginnings to think about things like identification and using identification keys, because there's not much to these as objects. So here's the kind of 4 body parts you have, or the 4 anatomical parts you have of these egg cases. Here's kind of the key, and so anybody can kind of work their way, knowing that this is what we call the bits and this, and all of a sudden you become, you can confidently identify 2 of the 4 species of Argonaut just by sight. So if you have these bobbly bits, this bottom egg case here, it makes you 1 species. If you have these long lateral lines, it makes you another. And it also introduces some of the problems with identification keys. So in this particular key, the last bit, you need to know where your thing came from in order to help identify it. So, a nice way for students for introducing, here are these keys with these characteristics, but you always need a piece of caution when you're using things like geographical origin. They are just a fantastic group of animals. I mean, I could easily talk all evening just about these. But what I find really kind of a mind-blowing thing to think about, and particularly for those of you who are used to perhaps using identification keys to work out what things are, we can use these characteristics of these 4 egg cases to very kind of confidently, with the exception of the geographical, to identify them to species. However, they are not part of the biological organism. They are secreted by the females, which have this web here. And functionally, we don't really know what the difference is. So why do some have bubbles rather than lines? So even though we don't really have an explanation for this particular morphological character, it's reliable enough that we can kind of reverse identify who the maker of them were. It's only the females that make them. They get very, very big. Males are tiny. We could talk about these endlessly, but unfortunately I don't have time. Another form of teaching and training I like to run, again, is the idea of introducing how we can think about evolution and development studies. And we start very simply with these 2 organisms here. So we have an octopus on the left and a squid on the right. And so I kind of say to, incredulous undergraduates, how many arms does an octopus have? And hopefully everybody from the age of 4 will, shout out 8. And then we say, how many arms does a squid have? People are not very confident about that at all. So we can, count them, and we come to the conclusion there are 10. And then I ask them how many tentacles does an octopus have, and everyone looks a bit blank. And the really smart people work out that it's some kind of trick question. And of course, well, I'll tell you the answer. Octopuses do not have tentacles at all. So in this group, going back to Aristotle, the octopuses are defined by having these 8 arms. Arms in this group, you have suckers all the way from the mouth all the way to the tip. The squid, including cuttlefish and ramshorn squid, etc., have those 8 arms, but also these 2 longer ones. So we think about the tentacles of the giant squid. Those are the 2 tentacles which are smooth all the way their length and have a tentacular club. So just from basic observation that a 5-year-old can do, that okay, if you believe me that I tell you these things are related, how can we explain the difference between the number of limbs? And normally people come to the hypothesis that okay, these may have lost a pair of limbs, these may have gained a pair of limbs, as the 2 kind of simple ways of explaining that. I then kind of throw in these exhibits, a bit like a court case, and say, okay, what about if I told you from the fossil record, we find fossils which these are evolved from, which have 10 unspecialized arms. So a bit like an octopus, 2 more. How does that modify our hypothesis? And most people get to, well, okay, octopuses lost 2 limbs, and squid have modified 2 limbs to be tentacles. I say, yes, very good. Then we confuse things even more, and I show them a vampire squid, which has these 8 arms and has these 2 little noodly bits here. The function of the noodles was only really worked out a couple of years ago. So how does that change our hypothesis? Because they have 8 and 2, but we kind of group them with there. And I keep kind of layering on with evidence from fossil record and evolutionary development biology. And to the end of the session, we get, starting with counting the number of limbs, which you can do on any preserved specimen or even a picture of these, building in fossil evidence and comparative anatomy and molecular studies and evolutionary development. We know, as far as we know today, the arrangement that we have is that the ancestors to these had 5 arm pairs, so 10 unspecialized arms. Squid did modify arm pair number 4 into these 2 tentacles. Interestingly, I think octopuses lost arm pair number 2. It's not that these guys didn't modify or lost the same arm that squid turned into tentacles. And then with these beautiful vampire squid, which are neither squid or octopuses, very confusing name, the noodles are a complete new evolution to them. So it's a kind of technically arm pair 6 from an evolutionary development biology point of view. And this activity I really like, because we start with something very, very basic that hopefully everyone can get a grasp of, and we end up talking about these quite complicated ideas, which, the science of developing these ideas is quite complicated, but the end hypothesis we reach, again, just starting with those questions, much like we talked about earlier with consciousness. Wrapping up quite quickly, during the pandemic, as many people in the museums kind of panicked with how do we turn our physical programming into a digital offer. This is well before I think a lot of people were sick of spending all their time on screens. We went back to basics. So shells have featured in still life depictions for centuries. And so we did these kind of virtual art classes. And I was happy to kind of pioneer the first one, or I guess guinea pig the first one in the museum, where we started with the Nautilus, these very iconic cephalopod shells. And so it was a bit of me talking about nautiluses and what they are and how they're related. And then it was these kind of, art attack type, still camera with some music for people kind of to sketch. This kind of went very well. We had a really positive response, and people were showing all their sketches and drawings from, given that each kind of landscape of shells, they had 5 minutes. We've got some really, really accomplished artworks, and the stuff that's more down my end of creating these artworks. But a colleague said to me, could we run these classes, because that was very interesting, for our blind and partially sighted communities that we work with, which I was keen to engage with. But of course, thinking, how are we going to do that remotely? This is before we could kind of meet up. And so we did the same kind of talk, but with these beautiful kind of raised images. So you can't really see them, but each of these lines is slightly raised. We've got a special printer which raises them. And so we prepared a pack of these, and then we sent them to all the participants. And then as I was talking through the slides, we'd say, okay, now get out, this particular image, and then participants were kind of feeling, and as I was describing the features. So again, starting with, a classic like an art class, and with a bit of creativity and input from colleagues, enabling some remote engagement with physical objects from blind and partially sighted visitors. I'll finish with the kind of artwork which I started with. So we've been working with my colleagues in community engagement at the museum, have been working with this early intervention art group. So people who are beginning to suffer from mental health issues, in workshops facilitated by an artist, creating works of art responding to the collection. And these, a couple of the participants were already quite interested in molluscs, in particular squid and cephalopods. And so my colleague said, would you mind showing them some? You don't really have to bait me too much to show people molluscs. So we had a fun afternoon in the stores, and we looked at fluid preserved specimens, I had a look at the shell collections, and I was just blown away by the artworks that they created, so including the ones here, which you probably can't see zoomed out, but when you start to look at some of these details, so here we have this repeated pattern, and this artwork is very good. I can recognize the the bobtail squid that it comes to. I want to know exactly where it is on display. This work here both incorporates the museum architecture, so you can see these arches, which you might have spotted from the first slide, and then tucked in between them, we have various organisms. We have a nice squid and an octopus here. This one I absolutely adore because you know, it looks like something like a starfish in the middle, but then when you see close up, all these details of the suckers of an octopus arm kind of interweaved. And then down here as well, we have the roof of the museum, but with these paired octopuses. So again, just from taking a spark of interest and really just giving a tiny amount of our time to kind of show people and share, we get these amazing artworks in response. I won't go through these, so these are some kind of bonus round if I got there. There's one kind of group of organisms which I'd like to give an honourable mention to. So this appeared on the slide at the beginning, which is looking at 30 major groups of animals. These are a whole different group. It's called dicotyledons or rhombozoans. What I love about them is...
Can you wait 5 minutes?
Oh, I think somebody's managed to unmute themselves. What I love about these is they have a fixed number of cells as an adult. They're microscopic organisms, but they are only known from the kind of nephridia or the kind of kidney type organ of cephalopod molluscs. So there's one major way of being an animal that only exists inside another animal. We don't really know how they get from one organism to another, and there are some really interesting theories. I will say these are kind of fringe theories as to what they represent. So some people think that these are a vestige of a parasite that used to be where some parasites go through different organisms. So they'll perhaps start in a fish and go to a snail and then go to a mammal in order to complete their life cycle. So some of the speculation is that these perhaps were a parasite that would move through extinct marine reptiles, things like mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, and then have part of their life stage in cephalopods. And then when the marine reptiles went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, through kind of emergency evolution action, if you like, skipped the rest of their life cycle and have this really, really reduced anatomy, which is very interesting. Other people propose that they're actually kind of protists, so one of the other ways of being a living organism that can kind of ingest and incorporate genetic material from its host. So we know there's lots of information about transgenics where organisms will engulf part of DNA or RNA sequences into their body, and some people suggest these are kind of neither animal nor protist, but some bizarre hybrid. So not only when we're thinking about molluscs, we have to think about all the organisms associated with them, and I just want to give a quick shout out, perhaps you've never heard of them, to these. They're either called dicotyledons or rhombozoans. There's some debate as to what the name should be, but you only find them inside cephalopods. So if you learned nothing else, perhaps you learned about these. Do have a look at them. There's 50 species, and there's a lot we don't know about. If this is lit a spark of passion for molluscs, then there are a few places you can go as a starting point. So we have this excellent kind of FSC series. We need a marine mollusk book, but for kind of land snails, slugs, freshwater snails, freshwater bivalves, you have these excellent guides. There are two organisations in the UK, Conchological Society and the Malacological Society of London, both of which concern themselves with molluscs. Both great organisations, lots of great people there, and they do a lot of work from amateur, just starting out interests, all the way through to professional communication. So if you're interested in molluscs, I suggest you go there. And I'm legally bound to say I also have a book out called Beautiful Shells, which is about beautiful shells. It's a reprint of a conchology from 1811, and so those images from 1811 are kind of reproduced. I tried to set the record straight for the guy who created them. He was kind of a bit maligned by the big shell book in London, but also I try and pick out an interesting shell on every single plate to kind of talk about. That's it. Thank you very much, and I believe there may be some time for questions.